The Brazilian government released a video showing a single indigenous man living alone in the forest without any other human contact for decades.
Welcome to Plain English, the podcast that goes at the right speed for English language learners. Listen now and read the transcript online at plainenglish.com. Now, here's Jeff, your host for today's episode.
A man has been living alone in the forest in Brazil for over 20 years after the other members of his indigenous tribe were killed in conflicts. He has survived alone, and a new video shows him energetically chopping down a tree. Welcome to episode 74 of Plain English. Today is Monday, August 10th, 2018. I'm Jeff. The producer is JR, and you are listening to the perfect podcast for practicing English. That's because, as you can hear, we go at a little slower speed than native speakers. But also, we have transcripts of every episode online. Today's transcript can be found at plainenglish.com/74, and you will see instant translations from English to Portuguese, Japanese, Spanish, Chinese, French, and Italian. Before we start on the story, I want to just tell you one word. I am going to use the word indigenous a lot in this episode. Indigenous communities are those that existed in an area before colonization. All over the Americas, for example, there are people whose ancestry, whose lineage, goes back to the people who were there before Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, etc., came to colonize an area. In the United States, we often refer to indigenous people as Native Americans. In Canada, they are called First Peoples. In the main story, I'll refer to an indigenous tribe or an indigenous man, and that refers to a tribe or a person whose ancestry and heritage can be traced back to people who were in South America before colonization by Spain and Portugal. There is a man living in the forest in Brazil who has had no human contact for decades. A new video released by the Brazilian government shows him in the woods chopping down a tree. Though the video is a few years old, the government knows he is still alive, a single person living alone in the Amazon. This indigenous man's story is a sad one. He probably belonged to one of the large indigenous tribes that were murdered or expelled by loggers and farmers in the 1970s and 1980s. He probably survived that tragedy and was part of a small group of just 6 survivors living together. Then, in 1995, farmers in the area killed the other 5 members of his tribe, leaving only this one man. As the sole survivor of that attack, he went back into the forest and has lived alone on this earth ever since. It has been 22 years. The Brazilian government has a department called FUNAI that is dedicated to indigenous affairs. FUNAI has decided that wherever possible, tribes that have not had contact with the outside world should be able to live in peace, but should have the choice to make friendly contact with the outside world if they want. That is consistent with the current ethical view of how to treat these isolated tribes. FUNAI goes into the forest every couple of months to check for evidence that the man is still alive. They usually know about where he is in the forest. They have approached him cautiously over the years, but he has rejected their invitations and has shown no interest in developing any type of sustained contact or relationship. He fires an arrow as a warning when anyone approaches him, so he has been left alone. The video that was recently released was actually recorded in 2011, but came to light for the first time this month. The video captures him through the forest, partially dressed, using an axe to cut down a tree. You can hear the axe hitting the tree and birds chirping in the background. You cannot see his face, but you can see him vigorously chopping amid the lush green landscape. He appears to be in good health, and experts believe he is between 55 and 60 years old. FUNAI does help this man in several ways. First, they help by leaving important things for him to find: axes, machetes, and seeds for new plants. Second, the Brazilian government has protected an area of about 20,000 acres, or just over 8,000 hectares, of forest for him to live in. This protected area in the state of Rondônia, near Bolivia, is totally surrounded by farms and ranches. But this man has not sought out any type of contact with the outside world, which is understandable given what happened to him. Remember, he has no language in common with anyone else in the world, and his only experience with civilization has been deadly conflict. It is incredible to think that today, in 2018, a human, a person who shares all of our DNA, who is fundamentally no different than any one of us, is living this life. He is living like our ancestors did long, long ago, except without any family connections and without any social bonds. He is building his own shelter. He is growing his own food. He grows corn, papaya, bananas, and potatoes. He uses a bow and arrow to hunt forest pigs, birds, and monkeys, sometimes using holes in the forest to trap his prey. He relaxes in a hammock. This man is an exception because he is living alone, but there are other tribes that live outside civilization. The word that is typically used to describe people in tribes like this is uncontacted people. Though, as the story of our indigenous man shows, they have actually had some contact with the outside world, oftentimes violent contact. Most, if not all tribes, would have at least seen a farm from a distance or seen or heard an airplane passing above. But to say they are uncontacted generally means that they have not had any meaningful social contact with global civilization. They don't know about the system of countries and cities and how big the world is. They are isolated from the languages, knowledge, and cultures of any other people besides their own tribe. Uncontacted tribes tend to live in densely forested areas of South America, Asia, and Africa. It is impossible to know how many uncontacted tribes there are in the world, much less how many people are in these tribes. Brazil and the island of New Guinea in Asia are thought to be home to the most uncontacted tribes in the world. Funai researchers, for example, believe there are 113 uncontacted tribes in Brazil alone. Time to say hi to a few people. Shenivaldo in Brazil wrote to say that he's tried learning English before and he's going to try one more time, but this is the last time, and he's using plain English. Shenivaldo, you're putting a lot of pressure on JR and me. Your last chance at English? Listen, you'll do fantastic. Just don't give up, okay? Another listener in Brazil is Ricardo. He was part of a WhatsApp group that recommended plain English. So there are all kinds of ways to spread the word. Ricardo, Shenivaldo, thanks for listening. Today's expression is much less. A fellow listener of yours noticed this in a previous episode and wrote to me on Facebook asking me about it. And then, as I was writing today's episode, I found myself using that expression again. So I figured, why not share the full context of this little linguistic device with everyone else? That's only fair, right? You can use much less when what you're about to say is definitely true because of something you said first. What you're about to say is definitely true because of something you said first. Now, it sounds confusing, but I promise it's not. I'm going to give you tons of examples today, and every time you hear the words much less, I want you to think in your mind, definitely. If the first thing is true, then the next thing is definitely true. So here we go. Back in episode 9, we were talking about how Saudi Arabia would allow movie theaters for the first time in decades, but the government would cut out any scenes they didn't want their people to see. Someone in Saudi Arabia said the government would cut out any kissing scenes, much less anything more romantic than that. The government won't let citizens see kissing, and they definitely won't let them see anything more romantic than kissing. And here is how I used it today. It is impossible to know how many uncontacted tribes there are in the world, much less how many people there are in these tribes. If we don't know how many tribes there are, we definitely don't know how many people are living in these tribes. Get it? Here are a few more examples. I can't run a mile, much less a marathon. That means if I can't run a mile, I definitely can't run a marathon, a 26-mile race. It's even more certain that I can't run a marathon if I can't even run a mile. Here it is again. I can't run a mile, much less a marathon. That's how you use it. So now listen to a few more examples. I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow, much less next Monday. Hey, if I can't look one day in the future, don't ask me to look 7 days in the future. I have a hard time waking up at 7 o'clock a.m., much less 5:30. If 7 o'clock is hard, then 5:30 is definitely hard. I can't even cook a plate of spaghetti, much less 2,000 chef-inspired meals, like the robot we talked about a few episodes back. This is a good little trick to be able to use, and I encourage you to practice it. It's really not hard at all, and it comes in handy sometimes. By the way, these examples were for illustration only. Don't worry, I can run a mile. I can get up at 5:30 if I have to. I can and do cook. And unfortunately, I know what I'm doing next Monday, which is going to work. And I also know what you're doing next Monday, which is downloading a new episode of Plain English. That's because we have new episodes every Monday and Thursday. You never have to worry about missing an episode if you subscribe to Plain English on Apple Podcasts or if you click follow on Spotify. See you next time.